Hi, this is Pastor Chris, and this is Trinity Officer Training, Session 4, Trinity Leadership Logistics. I'm glad you're here. We've covered a lot of good stuff in our previous sessions. You can find all of those at our officer resource page. The link is there on your screen. In our previous sessions, we've been exploring the theology of leadership in the Presbyterian Church and also how that applies to the work that we do here at Trinity. The first two sessions come from the Theocademy Resources of the Synod of Mid-America, and session 3 you spent with me. I hope if you haven't had time to review those sessions that you will do that. If you have any questions, do let me know. In our session today, we're going to be focused on leadership logistics. This is essentially how to help your committee and ministry area function smoothly and play well with others. So here are the 3 key things we'll be talking about today. First, 3 keys to a happy committee. How can you make sure things go smoothly with the folks you're working with? Secondly, some essential items about committee monthly reports, those things that we share out so that everyone is on the same page. And then finally, some finance basics. So let's look to 3 keys to a happy committee. The first key is a meeting agenda. Meeting agendas are really important for the work that we do. So let's look at a few key tips. Every agenda should have the date, time, and location of the meeting. If it's going to be a virtual meeting, go ahead and make sure you say that on the agenda. We're going to be meeting via Zoom, and here's the date, here's the time. Every meeting, every agenda should have an opening prayer. We're then going to have a section called approvals. This is where you approve the agenda. You make sure everything on the agenda is what you're actually going to want to talk about during that meeting. And then also approve any minutes from previous meetings. So, you'll approve those at the very beginning. You'll then move on to any unfinished business. Anything that you have addressed at a previous meeting but haven't wrapped up yet, this is where you're going to talk about that. Right? Then you move on to new business. So things that you haven't addressed at a previous meeting. Finally, you always end with a closing prayer. It's really important that we have an agenda for every meeting because it lets people know what to expect and plan for during the meeting. Again, this comes down to avoiding surprises and helping people feel prepared. There's a sample agenda showing this format on the officer's page. It also has a few other tips. So go ahead and take a look at that, give it a download, and let me know if you have any questions. There are a few other general tips. First, make sure you send the agenda fairly early, at least 24 hours prior to the meeting. 48 hours is better if it's possible. If you have something that comes up during the meeting that isn't on the agenda, try and say, we can talk about that, but we need to bump it to another meeting unless it's something that really needs urgent action. Try and limit discussion to things that are on your agenda. Remember, begin and end with prayer. It is a good thing to have this scheduled in advance. There are a lot of folks who don't like feeling put on the spot when it comes to praying, but they'd be happy to do it if they were asked. So my recommendation is to set up a rotation among all of the members on your committee and do that in advance. You could even do the whole year at once if you wanted to really be ahead of things and say, okay, this person is going to pray on this day, this person on that day, and then no one is caught off guard. The next key for a happy committee is communication. We've already talked about with agendas. Agendas are a good way to make sure that we're communicating, but let's look at a few other key tips. First, when in doubt, over communicate. It is better to share something 5 times or 10 times than no times. You've probably heard me say, or some of you may have heard me say, I would rather hear from 10 people about someone who is in the hospital as opposed to no people and not know about it. When in doubt, over communicate. Let people know the plan. Again, we want to avoid surprises or the feeling of being caught off guard. When people are surprised or caught off guard, they don't make their best decisions, and we want to help people make good decisions. And again, avoid surprises, right? This is not helpful for the healthy functioning of a committee. Finally, make sure everybody is included. This is as simple as make sure that you send communication to everybody on the committee, but it is also make sure you're using a method of communication that works well for everybody. Email tends to be good for most people, but maybe it isn't for someone on your committee. If you know that's the case, then we need to make sure we're communicating with them in a way that works. That could be text message, that could be phone call. Find out what the best method is for everyone on your committee and go with that. Make sure it works for everybody. The third key to a happy committee is scheduling. We all have a lot of work going on, and our lives tend to be pretty busy. And so doing what we can to make sure that schedules work well and everyone's on the same page, this is going to help people feel more comfortable with the work you're doing. Here are a few key tips. First, try to find a time that works for everyone on the committee. Again, this is not always going to be possible. There are going to be times that you just can't get all the schedules to work. But if someone is consistently unable to come to the meeting at your normal scheduled time, that's a pretty good sign that that's not a good time for them on a pretty regular basis. So consider setting a new time or seeing if there's one that could work better. This next point is really important. It's even critical. We need to make sure that all of our meetings are on the church calendar, both in-person meetings and electronic meetings. This avoids conflicts with other Trinity activities and with our facility partners at Brentwood. The way you do that is you schedule through the church office. Our office administrator is the keeper of the master calendar. And so if you have something going on, you need to let that person know. If there is going to be a change to your meeting, especially if you're not going to be having a meeting, please also let the office know. We use our master calendar as the way to set our building security system. And if we think someone's going to be here and have set doors to be unlocked and the alarm system off, but then that group ends up not showing up, that puts our facility at risk. So it's really important that we know when and where people are meeting. So those are 3 keys to a happy committee: making sure that you have a good, clear meeting agenda, that your communication is frequent and thorough, and that all of your scheduling is done with the church office so that everybody knows when everyone else is doing stuff and we can avoid potential conflicts. The next area we're going to talk about is committee monthly reports. In our last training session, the Trinity Leadership Model, we discussed one of the challenges of organizations being what some people call the siloing of information, where one group of the organization is working on a project, but another group doesn't know anything about it. And sometimes this can lead to duplication of effort or work. Sometimes it can even lead to conflicts. So it's really important that we keep open lines of communication between our different leadership groups. One of our major structural resources to avoid these situations and to more generally strengthen our collaborative leadership model is committee monthly reports. These reports streamline the process of information sharing between leadership groups and more broadly with the congregation. It also helps make sure that our organization's records are accurate and helpful if we need to review them in the future. Every committee monthly report has 3 sections. I'm going to highlight them, then we'll go into a bit more detail. The first basic item is action items for session. These are things that the session needs to take action on. Second is a summary that goes out to all of our leadership and then is published in the newsletter. And finally, the draft minutes for your monthly work with your committee. Let's take a look at each item in turn. Action items for session. It's really important that the session knows what action that we're being asked to take, and clearly stating action items in the monthly report is a really key way of communicating that information to the rest of leadership. When you list your action items, clearly state the desired action. Usually this is done in a single sentence, such as the X committee request session take the following action, or we move that, and then list the desired action. Now, one of the common questions about action items for session is, when do we actually need to send something to session and ask for session to do something with it, versus when can we just deal with it within our committee? So session action is needed under a few situations. First, if you are establishing or updating policies that are going to go into our manual of operations, then that's something that needs session approval. If you are going to be engaging in a new area of ministry, something that your committee's never done before and might feel like it's a bit outside of your established work in ministry, then you should bring session into the loop. If you're launching a novel project that is going to impact a large part of all of the congregation, then that's something that also needs session feedback. If you're going to need to allocate funds that are beyond your approved budget, you need to spend more than you've been given, then you need to bring session in for feedback. And finally, there are certain items that are required by the Book of Order. And those typically relate to sacraments, baptism and communion, but there are a few other items. So if it's required by the Book of Order, session has to act on it. If you aren't sure if something needs session action, then check with me or the clerk of session for guidance. The second item in your report is a summary for the newsletter and for leadership. This is a brief summary since your last report. If you have more than one meeting in a given time period, then you might actually be summarizing multiple meetings. If but again, the goal is just to give a brief summary, 2 to 4 sentences. This doesn't have to be super long, but just give some clear information. It should highlight upcoming opportunities for congregational events or activities, and also talk a little bit about long-term projects that you're currently working on. This summary is shared with our leadership and the congregation. This is what gets published in the newsletter every month, talking about the work of the church. So it's really important that we have these summaries so people have an idea of what our different committees are doing. The final area of your monthly report is minutes. Minutes are the official record of the business of your committee and should be kept for all official meetings, whether in person or electronic. They're not a transcript, but they should be an accurate reflection of the discussions and decisions that are taken during the meeting. Here is a basic guide. If someone is reading the minutes, they should be able to reasonably infer what transpired during the meeting. Now, your report will be, by definition, actually draft minutes because you haven't been to the next meeting in which to approve those minutes. That's okay. This is just to give a basic sense of what is going on in the work of your committee. The draft minutes aren't shared with the whole congregation because they haven't been approved yet, but it is really helpful for the rest of our leadership to have that information. If you would review the sample information, there's a document on the officers page that gives a guideline on how to format your monthly report and has a lot more information. Again, if you have questions, do let me know. So submitting a report is pretty simple. We want you to submit it as soon as is practical following your meeting, but we do want it no later than the Wednesday prior to the monthly session meeting. That gives plenty of time for that to be distributed out to all of the session and the rest of our leadership so that folks are all on the same page. So how do you submit it? Email the clerk of session. Just put it in a document and send it that way. Again, we have both a sample document of this that shows kind of how you can format it. We also have a template for a monthly report on the officers page. So you can download that and just edit that document each month and put your new information in there. So committee monthly reports are a key way that we make sure all of our leaders are on the same page about the work that's going on in the church. They contain action items for session. You may not have these every month, but if you do, it's really key that we have them there. A brief summary for the leadership that also gets published in the newsletter, along with a copy of the draft minutes for your most recent meetings since your last report. Now let's talk about our last section for today, finance basics. Your committee has a budget allocation for the year to accomplish your specific mission and ministry. In general, your committee has the authority to utilize these funds in the manner that you feel is appropriate. The important detail is that we ask you please use good stewardship in determining how, where, and when to utilize your budgeted funds. A good test for this is this a use of funds that is advancing the ministry and mission of the church? Then it's probably a thing that we should be doing. Just ask the question, is there a way to do this that is more cost effective? Is there a way to do this that accomplishes it in a more friendly way to the environment, to our church budget? Take those things into consideration and you're going to be on a good foundation. Let's talk about the actual process then of using your budgeted funds. In essence, there are 3 steps and we'll walk through those. The first is authorization. Before any use of church funds, before anything is purchased, the committee should approve the use of those funds. It should outline the items or the services that are approved for purchase as clearly as possible, especially if there are vendors that you're going to be hiring for something, or if there's a specific place you want items purchased from. And also the actual dollar amount that the committee has approved for this use. Authorizations always need 2 individuals from the committee, usually the officers, but not always, to give approval. And it can't include someone who might receive reimbursement for the purchase. A lot of times authorizations actually happen in the course of a committee meeting, and then if the authorization can be documented in the minutes, and that serves as the authorization document. Once there's an authorization that is documented and clear, then the purchase can be made. We'll talk a little bit more about the actual process of that in a minute, but there is a third step, and that is documentation. It's really important that we have documentation of all items that are purchased for the church or services that are brought on board that shows that the funds were spent in accordance with the initial authorization. This usually can just be a receipt or an invoice for the product or service, but we do have to have some paperwork that shows how the money was spent. This is not just to make sure we're using our funds in accordance with our plan, but it's also for future record keeping for when we do our financial audits. Let's talk about making a purchase for a moment. One thing you should consider is whether or not you want to use a Trinity account to make the purchase as opposed to using someone's private funds and then asking for a reimbursement. When it's possible or practical, consider making purchases using our Trinity credit card or an account we have at a local business. Several staff members, myself, Carla, plus our treasurer, have access to the Trinity credit card. This allows purchases to be made directly and avoid the need for you seeking a reimbursement. You have to provide the approval documentation prior to a staff member or a treasurer making a purchase. This is to protect us, to make sure that we are making purchases that have been approved. And then also remember that we have business accounts with a number of vendors that allow us to purchase a lot of items cheaper than standard retail cost. This can be things like office supplies through Office Depot, books through the Presbyterian Publishing Corporation. That could be all sorts of different resources. We have an Amazon business account. So think about, if there's something that you need to buy, especially something in large quantities, check with a staff member and we can see if we have an account that might be able to get us a better price. If it isn't possible or practical for you to make a purchase with a Trinity account or with a Trinity credit card, then you can make a purchase with your own funds and then submit a check request for reimbursement. Again, you need authorization from the committee as noted above, and then this check request needs 2 signatures from 2 individuals who aren't the person being reimbursed. One of those does need to be an officer on the committee whose funds are being allocated. There's a copy of this check request document on the officer's resource page. We also keep paper copies outside the finance office here at church. Please remember that Trinity is a tax-exempt organization with both Missouri and IRS 501c3 exempt status. So if you are making purchases, we do need to submit tax exemption paperwork on that. Usually all you need to submit is a copy of our tax document, our tax exempt letter. We keep copies of that here at the church. So if you need a copy for something, just let me know or let the office know and we'll get you one. Finally, if your committee approves a grant or a donation to an organization where we're going to need to send them a check or a payment, please inform the treasurer as soon as you can following the meeting where that authorization has been made. Provide a copy of the draft minutes for approval purposes, along with the amount of the grant or donation and the contact information. Where do we actually need to mail the check? Where the check should be sent. Please don't assume that the treasurer is going to see your approval noted in the summary report and automatically know where to send the money. We need to clearly communicate with our treasurer the information so that they're able to process things promptly. So in conclusion, we've covered a lot of logistics in this section. We've talked about keys to a happy committee. We've talked about monthly reports and finance basics. So if you need a refresher on anything we've talked about, feel free to rewatch some or all of this session as you need. You can also find all of the documents that I referenced during this session on our officer's resource page. So make sure to download them for more details. Some of them do have some additional explanation in there that is helpful. So consider downloading those. Just as a review, in this section, we have talked about 3 keys to a happy committee. That's agendas, communication, and scheduling. We've talked about committee monthly reports, and we've covered some finance basics for your committee. Thank you so much for taking part in Trinity Officer Training Session 4. I hope and trust this has been helpful to you. If there is anything that's come up in this session that you aren't sure about or you need more information, please let me know. But until then, we look forward to working with you here at Trinity, and you can look forward to Session 5, which is coming soon. That is Church Database Basics. That's how to use our church online database to get information and contact details for members of Trinity. Thanks, and have a great day.